A solid shot slammed into the frontal armor. The screech of rending metal instantly drowned out the roar of the diesel engine. 46 tons of Soviet steel hurtled at full speed into a prepared kill zone. 8 concealed German machines against a single breakthrough tank. 1 heavy gun against 8 long-barreled cannons. The engine roared, straining to push the multi-ton mass toward an invisible enemy. The probability of survival trended toward 0. 1944, East Prussia. Autumn fog choked visibility down to 50 meters. The battlefield had turned into a solid gray wall. The ambush had sprung. Tank Commander Sokolov gripped the edges of the turret hatch with a white-knuckled death grip. The monstrous impact made his jaw snap shut, and the sharp taste of blood filled his mouth instantly. The Iosif Stalin II heavy tank didn't stop. Stopping meant death. The thick, milky fog around them was constantly torn by the yellow flashes of gunfire. The enemy was firing blind, German gunners orienting themselves by the low clatter of wide tracks and the vibration of the frozen earth. The cast armor hummed continuously from the near misses of heavy shells. The air instantly filled with the acrid stench of burnt powder and white-hot metal. "Gromov, stay sharp! Push it!" Sokolov barked into the intercom. "I'm holding the RPMs!" The driver's muffled rasp broke through the crackle of interference. Gromov hauled on the steering levers with everything he had. The heavy machine lunged violently from side to side, breaking the enemy's aiming solution. It was blind maneuvering amidst a constant threat. Another shell shrieked as it gouged the cast turret, sending a shower of sparks erupting into the gloom. 120 millimeters of frontal armor held the blow. The metal absorbed the kinetic energy, leaving the crew with a dull concussion. Every hit echoed with a blunt ringing in their ears, their bodies soaking up the fine vibration of the impacts against the hull. The fog reliably concealed the silhouettes of the enemy machines. 8 Panther medium tanks had formed a classic horseshoe, and the ring was tightening. Their 75mm guns methodically spat out steel, the volume of fire growing with every passing second. Sokolov pressed himself against the observation devices. The periscope glass was covered in a thick web of fine cracks from a nearby HE shell burst, narrowing his field of vision to a blurry strip of gray haze. Instinct dictated the only rule of survival. You couldn't stand still. There was nowhere to retreat, only forward into the storm of crossfire. The loader collapsed heavily to his knees, desperately trying to keep his balance. Spent casings rolled with a clatter under his boots as the ribbed floor heaved. The machine jumped violently in the deep ruts of the ruined road. Two-stage loading required colossal physical effort, and every movement caused a dull ache. The loader's hands shook from the strain, the metal of the casings burning his palms, even through thick canvas gloves. There was almost no free space left inside the cramped turret. "Target!" the gunner exhaled. A blurred shadow flickered dead ahead to the right. The fog parted for a fraction of a second, exposing an angular silhouette with its characteristic long barrel and muzzle brake. "Armor piercing! Maintain course!" Sokolov commanded. Instincts replaced tactics. In a blind fight, the fastest shot won. The heavy wedge breech slammed shut with a loud metallic clank. The 122mm shell, weighing 25 kilograms, thudded into the chamber, followed by the dense powder charge. "Ready!" The loader's shout broke into a strained rasp. Another direct hit rocked the heavy hull. The tank jerked sharply to the left as a piercing screech of tearing metal rang out. The left track lost its grip, catching hard on the edge of a deep crater. Speed dropped instantly to a critical level. The machine froze in the crosshairs of 8 barrels. The diesel engine sputtered, the RPMs plummeting. "Gromov, pull us out!" Sokolov roared. A yank of the cold levers. The throttle pedal hit the floor. The transmission wailed under the strain as the driver squeezed the absolute maximum power out of the engine. The steel track bit into the earth again, sending chunks of wet mud and ice flying in all directions. The machine leveled out heavily, tearing itself from the pit as its momentum began to slowly recover. The second-long delay had nearly become a fatal endpoint. The fog closed in tightly again. The German gunners coolly corrected their fire based on the roar of the engine. Shells were landing closer and closer to the rear, and the earth trembled from multiple explosions. Sokolov assessed the situation. Cold calculations suggested the total destruction of the Soviet machine within the next 3 minutes. The armor couldn't hold forever. Metal fatigue was inevitably accumulating with every new impact. Micro cracks were spreading across the glacis plate, and the welds groaned under the colossal kinetic pressure. 8 guns were guaranteed to penetrate if they concentrated their fire on a single point. They needed to close the distance immediately, to enter a brutal, close-quarters fight where the great length of the German barrels would become a liability. "Gromov, 10 degrees left, straight at their flashes." "Copy that." The tank lunged blindly into the thick of the kill zone, a frontal assault on the ambush. An AP shell grazed the right side of the turret, tearing the thick metal handrails out by the roots. The stench of acrid burning intensified sharply. Blue-gray smoke quickly filled the cramped fighting compartment, making breathing unbearably difficult. Eyes watered from the concentrated powder fumes, and throats were raw from the metallic dust. Inside the vibrating iron box, the men worked at the limits of human physiology. The loader was stripping the skin off his hands until they bled against the rough metal of the breech, continuously hauling the heavy ammunition. The gunner's eyes were locked onto the narrow optics of the sight, blood seeping from a brow split against the eyepiece and flooding his eye. Sokolov monotonically dictated the direction of movement through the roar. The commander's voice sounded steady, hard, and devoid of emotion. Fear had completely burned away in the first seconds after the hit. Only muscle reflex remained, the cold work of survival. Ahead, a new silhouette loomed out of the gray shroud. The wind tore the fog for a moment, and the distance rapidly closed to 40 meters. The German machine's gun was pointed exactly at the Soviet tank's lower glacis. It was a matter of fractions of a second. "Fire!" The heavy gun's report coincided with a new direct hit on the turret. A deafening ring struck the crew's eardrums, and the light in the fighting compartment went out instantly. The clatter of tank treads tore at their hearing. The deafening screech of wide steel tracks on frozen stone drowned out the dull thrum of the massive diesel. The heavy machine relentlessly crushed the earth, which was pitted with deep craters. In Commander Sokolov's headset, the radio crackled sharply. The airwaves broke through the thick interference with a short, dry phrase. The headquarters order left no room for maneuver. Break through the tight ring of the German ambush at any cost. Command was betting everything on the crew of this single heavy machine. The tank was being thrown head-on against a superior enemy, acting as the only battering ram capable of punching a hole in the German defensive line. Retreat meant the total failure of the entire frontline offensive. Sokolov accepted the information in silence, his jaw clenching tighter. The tank didn't slow down for a single second, the tachometer needle quivering constantly in the red. The machine was violently jolted on the road, which had been shattered by heavy artillery. 46 tons of cast steel and rolled armor were tossed over deep pits. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, a true hell of physical exhaustion reigned. The loader was working at the very limit of human endurance. The process of two-stage loading for the massive gun had turned into a continuous, sophisticated torture. The 122mm barrel required a constant diet of metal and powder. He had to pull a massive 25-kilogram AP shell from the cramped ammo rack during the frantic pitching. A sudden, powerful jolt of the hull threw him onto the cold, ribbed floor. His hands, in their thick protective gloves, slipped. Bare skin was torn to the raw meat against the rough steel edge of the breech with a crunch. Blood sprayed onto the white-hot metal. Sharp pain pierced his forearm, but the loader only gave a low growl. He didn't allow himself to stop for a single moment. His bloodied fingers gripped the smooth steel of the heavy casing again with a death grip. His back muscles groaned under the colossal strain as the metal entered the breech with a dull clank. The massive wedge breech clicked shut, sealing the way back. The heavy gun swallowed its new portion of death. Thick powder fumes from previous shots were rapidly accumulating in the cramped turret. The standard ventilation system was completely unable to handle the extreme intensity of the battle. The blue-gray toxic gas mercilessly stung their eyes, and breathing became physically painful. Every gasping breath scorched their lungs with acrid chemical smoke. Oxygen was burning out fast in the enclosed space. The crew was slowly suffocating in the white-hot steel box, their faces covered in a thick crust of black soot mixed with cold sweat. Their eyes were red and inflamed from the constant strain. The temperature inside the tank rose relentlessly as suffocating heat radiated from the engine, working at its limit. The enclosed, cramped space pressed hard on their psyche. Outside, a firestorm raged continuously. The armor shuddered from the lashing impacts of small fragments and shrieking ricochets. Life had narrowed to the microscopic radius of a steel capsule. Beyond the thick armor plates, there was only instantaneous, blind death. Another enemy slug tore up the earth literally a meter from the left side. A monstrous shockwave struck the running gear hard, and the multi-ton tank suddenly skidded on the slick mud. "Gromov, hold the machine! Crush them!" Sokolov rasped into the intercom mic. "I'm pulling her out," the driver barked through gritted teeth. Gromov threw his entire weight against the stiff metal steering levers. The iron desperately resisted the effort, and his shoulder muscles burned like fire from the unbearable load. The powerful diesel engine roared, straining at its maximum RPMs, visibly choking from the lack of clean air and the resistance of the viscous soil. The driver threw the multi-ton steel mass into a sharp, unpredictable lunge forward and slightly to the right. The wide tracks bit into the frozen earth with a wild screech, kicking up fountains of ice chips and sparks. The tank's trajectory broke every second. The German gunners lost their precise aim in the thick fog, their shells shrieking through the void exactly where the Soviet heavy machine had been just a second before. The survival instinct had completely displaced paralyzing fear. Only cold, mechanical work remained. Movement became the only form of existence. The blind autumn fog gave the tankers no chance for error. The space of visual control had narrowed to the length of their own gun barrel. Every bump on the sodden road could be the final point of the route. Every dark silhouette emerging from the milky haze carried a direct, inevitable threat. The tank relentlessly closed the distance with an invisible but deadly enemy. The sounds of nearby explosions merged into one endless, heavy, ear-pressing roar. The men's nerves were stretched like taut steel cables. The crew had finally turned into a single biological mechanism, hardwired into the war machine. Calculating human reason gave way to primal animal instinct. Sokolov continuously rotated the commander's periscope until his neck ached. The narrow field of view remained clear for now, but the constant fine vibration of the hull suggested otherwise. The enemy was very close. The ambush was tightening the steel noose. The pressure mounted with every second of this endless dash through the gloom. Suddenly, the thick shroud of gray fog directly ahead flickered. The air seemed to thicken into one dense mass. A blurry dark spot began to rapidly take on the hard, geometrically correct outlines of a heavy German machine's frontal armor. The distance was inevitably collapsing to a critical minimum. The fog burst, tearing into gray rags. The distance rapidly closed to 30 meters. A huge, angular shadow emerged from the thick haze, which was saturated with powder smoke. The enemy machine's wide tracks heavily churned the sodden Prussian earth. The long gun barrel, with its massive muzzle brake, looked straight into the face of the Soviet tank. A German medium tank. A Panther. An ambush machine. The enemy had waited for the perfect moment. The point-blank range left no chance for survival. Armor penetration was guaranteed. A blinding yellow flash erupted from the muzzle of the enemy barrel. A 75mm shell sped toward the target. The air compressed. Time stopped. Thoughts vanished. The mind shut down completely. Only raw, primal reflex remained. The driver, Gromov, acted a fraction of a second faster than the encroaching death. The left steering lever went to its limit, back, all the way, until his shoulder joint crunched. The steel band of the left track locked tight. The metal screeched. The right track continued to tear the frozen ground at full RPMs. 46 tons of Soviet metal instantly lost their straight trajectory. The massive kinetic mass went into an uncontrolled skid, a drift. The heavy hull swung sharply sideways. Inertia mercilessly threw the crew against the cold steel of the bulkheads. The track links shrieked as they scraped the protruding stones of the pavement. The earth responded to the monstrous friction with a fine tremor. The stench of burnt metal and white-hot brake bands hit their noses. The tank stood at a sharp angle to the enemy's line of fire. The enemy slug hit the cast-sloped turret. The angle of impact between the shell and the armor changed at the very last moment of the life-saving maneuver. The armor took the terrifying blow at a tangent. A shower of blinding white sparks sprayed in all directions, cutting through the fog. The metal wailed. The heavy shell, with a deafening, unbearable shriek, ricocheted, ripping through the thick, damp air over the tankers' heads. The shockwave shook the heavy machine from its lower tracks to the commander's cupola. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, the interior light fixtures shattered with a dry crack. Fine broken glass rained down. Thick dust and sharp metal scale shook loose from the ceiling, clogging their eyes. Their eardrums were pressed into their skulls with a dull pain. Thick, dark blood gushed from the gunner's nose, and a persistent, nauseating taste of copper appeared in his mouth. The engine sputtered under its own strained roar. The RPMs dropped sharply, but the inertia of the multi-ton steel behemoth continued to relentlessly push the Soviet tank forward. Gromov let go of the levers. Avoiding a head-on collision was already impossible. There was no braking distance. Only one way out remained. Ramming. 46 tons of Soviet cast steel slammed into the side of the German machine at full speed. The deafening crash of the direct collision completely drowned out all the sounds of the surrounding artillery cannonade. The thick welds of the hull cracked piteously. The armor plates shuddered from the extreme kinetic load. The Panther's running gear snapped with a dry crunch under the monstrous pressure. The interleaved road wheels were instantly crushed into a shapeless mass. The tensioned tracks snapped with the sharp sound of a broken steel string. The German tank tilted heavily onto its right side. Metal tore metal with a wild screech. The sound of thick armor being ripped apart grated on their ears, penetrating straight into the brain. The Soviet heavy machine, with all its mass, loomed over the crushed, mangled side of the enemy. The close quarters distance had shrunk to absolute zero. The long barrel of the 122mm gun, with a dull clank, pressed directly into the frontal plate of the Panther's turret. The hard metal of the barrel stripped away the Zimmerit coating. "Target!" Sokolov rasped, bloody saliva spraying onto the throat mic. "Firing!" the gunner exhaled, throwing his entire weight onto the stiff firing pedal. The massive gun spat out a wide plume of blinding flame. A huge AP shell, weighing nearly 25 kilograms, hit the thin side armor point blank. The distance didn't even allow the shell to reach full velocity, but the kinetic energy was more than enough. The enemy's armor burst. The shell punched through the machine's innards. The heavy wedge breech flew back with a metallic clank, ejecting the empty, smoking casing onto the floor littered with spent iron. The powerful recoil threw the barrel back with force. Inside the German machine, the entire stowed ammunition load instantly ignited. Dozens of heavy shells detonated simultaneously. The earth shook from a dull internal explosion of gargantuan force. The Panther's heavy turret was torn from its ring with a horrific, prolonged screech. The multi-ton piece of steel, spewing thick fire, flew into the air on a pillar of roaring flame. The shockwave from the ultra-close explosion struck the Soviet tank's glacis plate hard. Scorching flames licked the narrow vision slits of the periscopes. An unbearable, suffocating heat from the open fire hit the tanker's soot-covered faces. The enemy ceased to exist. In place of the elite ambush machine, only a smoldering steel carcass, torn apart from the inside, remained. The chaos of close-quarters combat continued to dictate its rules. The crew acted on pure automation. Instincts had completely overcome the physiological shock. The driver depressed the stiff clutch, forcing the mangled but living tank to crawl heavily off the crushed remains of the enemy. The roar of the diesel began to pick up high RPMs again. The heavy metal screeched as it freed itself from the deadly snag. Thick black smoke obscured the view. Survival required continuous movement. The enemy machine's wreck turned into a blazing torch. A firestorm greedily devoured the mangled metal. The heavy Soviet tank slid off the savaged armor with a piercing screech. The tracks ground the fragments of the enemy's running gear with a dry crunch. The ring of the ambush had suffered a deep crack. Behind them remained a dead zone, densely littered with burning iron. But the machine did not slow its deadly pace. Reducing speed even for a moment meant certain death. The surviving German anti-tank gun crews hastily shifted their fire to the breakout monster. The air instantly filled with the dense, continuous whistle of flying shrapnel. Driver Gromov steered the 46-ton behemoth solely on raw, exposed animal instincts. He physically felt the trajectory of the flying death with his skin. The stiff steering levers shook violently in his hands, which were gripped tight and worn down to deep, bloody blisters. The tank was thrown sharply and unpredictably from side to side. The jagged, chaotic rhythm of movement broke the calculated aim of the experienced German gunners. Heavy slugs, with a wicked, prolonged howl, ripped through the void literally a meter from the cast, sloped turret. By some miracle, The crew survived in this raging steel storm. The autumn fog began to mix heavily with thick, suffocating brick dust. Ahead, the grim, war-torn skeletons of the Königsberg outskirts loomed out of the gray shroud. The narrow, winding streets had turned into a solid, impassable line of deadly obstacles. A massive, solid barricade made of broken stone, sandbags, and thick steel beams blocked the way. Gromov didn't even think of looking for a bypass maneuver. He slammed the stiff throttle pedal into the ribbed floor with force, all the way down. The massive 520 horsepower diesel engine roared, straining at the very limit of its technical capabilities. The multi-ton steel hull, with a short burst of speed, slammed hard into the center of the fortified barrier. The thick brickwork shattered in all directions with a dry, deafening crack. The steel support beams bent into arcs, scraping the armored belly of the machine with a piercing, nauseating shriek. The Soviet tank smashed through the obstruction, leaving a wide path behind it. Sharp stone chips rained down on the white-hot armor in a thick, heavy downpour. The wide tracks ruthlessly crushed the debris of collapsed buildings into fine gray dust. Around them, secondary detonations thundered continuously, merging into one solid roar. Secret ammunition dumps hidden deep under the rubble were exploding. Powerful shockwaves tossed the heavy machine from side to side. The frozen earth gave way beneath the heavy road wheels. Fine, acrid cement dust instantly clogged the narrow vision slits of the periscopes. The optical instruments went blind. The commander's field of vision narrowed to an absolute, critical minimum. Blindness had now become the crew's main, most dangerous enemy. The tanker's eyes watered continuously from the thick suspension hanging in the air. The men inside the white-hot steel box were slowly, inevitably, suffocating. The temperature in the cramped fighting compartment had long since passed any conceivable critical mark. Sticky, cold sweat poured over faces black with soot, mixing with acrid powder fumes and clotted blood from broken noses. Their eardrums throbbed painfully from the constant, sharp pressure drops after every shot of their own gun and every hit on the armor. Human hearing had almost completely vanished. Only the continuous, maddening, fine vibration of the armored hull remained. Any words had finally lost their meaning in this roar. Commands were given exclusively by short, hard shoves or dull, unintelligible growls into the sweat-soaked throat mics. The crew had finally ceased to be a group of 4 separate living human beings. Commander Sokolov, the gunner, the loader, and the driver had merged into a single, flawless, destructive mechanism. The loader's exhausted muscles threw new, heavy shells into the white-hot breach absolutely automatically, without the involvement of the mind. The gunner's bloodied hands were locked onto the stiff handwheels of the laying mechanisms. Sokolov guided this blind steel body with short, precise touches to the gunner's shoulders. A complete, absolute physiological synchronization had emerged. Movement was made solely to stay ahead of the situation. No extra frantic movements, no crippling doubts. The fleeting illusion of total invulnerability played its cruel, fatal trick. From behind the collapsed corner of a half-ruined brick building, a well-camouflaged anti-tank gun suddenly opened fire. A brutal shot at point-blank range. The heavy armor-piercing slug slammed into the right side of the hull with a savage screech. The thick cast armor groaned under the colossal pressure. The metal buckled dangerously into the fighting compartment, but it held against the terrifying kinetic impact. High-quality welds snapped with a sharp crack. A spray of white-hot spall showered the cramped interior. Razor-sharp internal fragments of the tank's own armor bit deep into the loader's left shoulder. He let out a short, muffled cry and slumped heavily onto the ribbed floor, which was littered with slick shell casings. The rhythm of the loading cycle broke instantly. "You alive?" Sokolov barked, his eyes never leaving the murky sight for even a fraction of a second. "I'm good. Still in the fight," came the hollow, raspy reply, through teeth clenched tight against unbearable pain. With a desperate surge of will, the loader hauled himself up on trembling legs. Dark blood pulsed down his filthy, sweat-soaked tunic. His mangled left arm hung uselessly like a whip. He frantically grabbed a 55-pound armor-piercing shell with his one good hand. He threw his entire body weight against the cold metal, shoving it into the breach with a guttural wheeze. "Up! On the way!" The crushing return fire from the 122mm main gun completely obliterated the corner of the brick building, along with the German crew hidden there. Pulverized brick and massive chunks of gray concrete soared high into the air. The deadly firing point ceased to exist. But the long-awaited breather never came. The overloaded diesel engine began to falter. Thick, oily smoke from numerous fires choked the air intakes. The engine RPMs began to drop threateningly. The driver desperately worked the throttle, trying at all costs to keep the exhausted engine from a fatal stall. To flame out in this stone trap meant becoming a massive, stationary target.
The heavy Soviet tank continued its blind, destructive run through the burning ruins with the last of its strength. Every new second of this relentless movement burned through the meager remains of their energy. The armored machine's service life was rapidly hitting its limit. The physical capacity of the men inside had long since been spent. They remained conscious only on sheer stubbornness and a primal urge to survive. Steel was melting from the extreme tension. The air inside the fighting compartment shimmered from the unbearable heat. The diesel was running itself to death. The heavy Soviet machine tore through the last meters of the urban sprawl. The road wheels crunched through broken brick and twisted metal. Only one short dash remained to the designated breakout point. The crew was running on pure adrenaline and muscle memory. The air in the cramped fighting compartment scorched their lungs with an acrid chemical stench. The radio operator suddenly ripped the thick leather tanker's helmet from his head. The heavy earphones struck the steel bulkhead with a dull thud. The operator's face instantly contorted from extreme strain. He had intercepted an open radio signal. A short, sharp German command cut through the airwaves on the short-range frequency. The ambush hadn't ended at the outskirts. The main threat was just now moving into its firing position. Ahead lay an open square, completely exposed to fire. The tall ruins fell away to the sides. A thick shroud of cement dust and acrid soot hung heavily over the cratered cobblestones. The wind slammed into the center of the square. The dust reluctantly drifted apart, revealing a panorama of destruction. Directly in the Soviet machine's path, a low-slung, angular silhouette emerged from the gray haze. The pitch-black armored hull blended perfectly with the deep shadows of the ruined buildings. A heavy German tank. An ambush predator. The tool of an expert hunter. The elite enemy had taken up a flawless position for a killing shot well in advance. The long barrel of the 88mm gun was already leveled directly at the Soviet tank's upper glacis. The enemy crew didn't waste a single precious second on aiming. They knew the exact path of the oncoming Soviet machine. The German commander had calculated Sokolov's maneuver down to the centimeter.
It was a terrifying mirror image. The same predatory honed instinct, the same absolute ruthless automation of seasoned professionals. They hungered to break this daring thrust and destroy the crew at any cost. They had been waiting for this exact moment. The black tank fired first. A blinding yellow flash violently tore through the twilight of the dust storm. An armor-piercing shell weighing over 20 pounds crossed the distance in an imperceptible fraction of a second. A horrific, crushing blow rocked 46 tons of Soviet steel. The multi-ton machine jerked back with a violent clang, as if it had slammed into an invisible monolithic concrete wall at full speed. A deafening, piercing ring instantly ruptured eardrums. The interior lights went out immediately. The cramped fighting compartment was plunged into absolute, thick, tangible darkness. The acrid stench of burning wiring hit their nostrils hard. Bright blue sparks from a short circuit sprayed from the damaged junction box on the bulkhead. Time froze. The air compressed into a single, tight, unbearably scorched lump. 3 long seconds of total silence felt like an eternity. Then, a dim, flickering emergency lamp blinked under the ceiling. The haunting red light caught the soot-covered faces of the crew in the gloom. The 120mm thick frontal armor had withstood a direct, sniper-accurate hit. The monstrous kinetic energy had dissipated into a deep plastic deformation of the upper armor plate. The thick welds groaned threateningly along their entire length, but miraculously held the structure together.
"Report!" Commander Sokolov's voice sounded absolutely dry, without the slightest tremor or panic.
"Armor's holding. Still moving for now," Gromov, the driver, replied in a hollow, strained voice, his white knuckles gripping the heavy steering levers. "Gun's good. Electric triggers are hot," the gunner said, quickly and habitually pressing his face to the rubber eyepiece of the optics. "We're still breathing," the wounded loader spat viciously. With his one good hand, he was forcefully ramming a fresh, heavy shell into the smoking breach. A short, brutally hard statement of raw facts. No wasted emotion, only a dry, professional assessment of their current combat effectiveness. The crippled tank had turned into a cornered but extremely dangerous beast. The enemy made no attempt to change cover. The black tank stood absolutely still, like a monolithic granite crag among the smoking ruins. The German ace was confidently, methodically reloading his lethal gun. He knew for certain that the second aimed shot would be final and fatal for the Soviet machine. He knew the heavy tank's weak points perfectly from dozens of previous engagements. The vulnerable driver's vision slit, the massive gun mantlet, the narrow turret ring. The German gunner coolly, without haste, adjusted his aim through his superb optics. The dueling distance did not exceed 400 meters, the perfect range for a guaranteed kill of heavy armor. Sokolov instantly, in a split second, assessed the situation on the square. In a direct, head-on confrontation in the open, their chances of survival were rapidly plummeting toward zero. The Soviet 122mm gun possessed colossal, bone-crushing power, but it was critically inferior to the long-barreled German gun in terms of combat rate of fire. The separate loading of the heavy, armor-piercing ammunition demanded precious time. The enemy always fired faster. The enemy always fired truer. The direct hit had left the entire Soviet crew heavily concussed.
Thick, dark circles swam before their eyes. Blood pounded heavily and rhythmically in their temples, counting down the final moments until the next inevitable volley. The engine was running with a severe rhythmic stutter.
The power plant was literally choking from a lack of oxygen in the smoke-clogged square. The machine was a perfect, high-contrast target against the pale cement dust. Retreating into the narrow streets behind them was out of the question. Exposing a vulnerable side to the German ace meant certain, instantaneous death in the form of a catastrophic ammunition cook-off. Gromov instinctively lurched the tank slightly forward and hard to the left, trying to throw off the enemy gunner's carefully calibrated aim. The wide tracks clattered loudly against the slick, broken stone. The black machine ahead barely twitched its long barrel, tracking the short, desperate maneuver with precision. The hunter held his prey on a short, invisible steel leash. The tension inside the hull reached its breaking point. The armor plate vibrated faintly. The second shell was already in the enemy's breach. The heavy, positional duel began. The open square instantly transformed into a killing floor amidst the smoldering wreckage of city buildings. The Soviet tank struck back, firing first. The 122mm gun spat a wide plume of searing flame. The armor-piercing shell, weighing nearly 55 pounds, crossed the gap in a heartbeat. Impact. The piercing screech of tearing metal deafened the crew. The impenetrable frontal armor of the black German tank completely withstood the direct hit. The slope of the thick steel plates played its decisive role. The heavy slug ricocheted with a wild howl. A shower of blindingly white sparks sprayed in all directions. Red-hot chunks of metal struck the diesel-soaked cobblestones. Spilled fuel from previously destroyed vehicles instantly ignited.
Greedy flames began to rapidly consume the dead machinery surrounding the duelists, cutting off any path for retreat. The enemy answered immediately. A second 88mm shell slammed directly into the Soviet machine's massive gun mantlet. A monstrous roar shook the multi-ton armored hull. Pressure spiked sharply inside the cramped steel box of the turret. The air compressed into a single, dense, unbearably heavy mass. Thick, dark blood erupted from the gunner's nose. His eardrums were crushed deep into his skull with a dull pain. There was absolutely nothing to breathe. The oxygen had completely burned out in the confined space. The standard ventilation system helplessly circulated thick, bluish propellant smoke. Sticky blood coated the gunner's chin, falling in heavy drops onto the cold metal of the stiff laying mechanisms. "Front plate won't take it," the gunner spat, along with a dark clot of blood. "Load AP," Sokolov rasped. "Gromov, don't just sit there. Throw the machine around." The driver gripped the slick control levers with a death grip. The muscles in his back and shoulders locked in a painful, unceasing cramp. He violently yanked the left clutch toward him. The 46-ton machine dipped its nose and lurched left. Another calculated German shell passed within inches of the sloped turret with a vicious, prolonged wail. The armor hummed dully from the ultra-close shockwave. Gromov threw the tank from side to side among the burning wreckage. He squeezed the very last drops of power out of the tortured diesel engine. The movement was a series of short, erratic jerks. Stopping meant guaranteed instant death. The wounded loader was working beyond the limits of human capability. His healthy right hand frantically snatched a new, heavy round from the cramped ammo rack. His muscles groaned under the unbearable, tendon-tearing strain. He threw his entire body weight against the cold steel of the casing. He drove the massive 55-pound shell into the smoking breech. The heavy wedge breech block snapped shut with a dry, metallic clack. The gun swallowed another portion of death. "Up!" The loader's wild scream broke into a hacking cough. The tank fired again. The brutal recoil slammed the barrel back with force. The empty casing ejected with a loud clang onto the ribbed floor,
which was now carpeted in spent brass. Another direct hit on the enemy machine. And again, a violent ricochet. The German ace's black armor held hit after hit. It was a true death grind of iron. Armor against armor. The screech of buckling metal completely drowned out the strained roar of the tank engines. The enemy coolly, methodically hammered his shells into the Soviet tank's frontal plate. Micro-cracks were relentlessly spreading across the thick cast steel. Reliable welds groaned threateningly under the extreme kinetic pressure. Both crews were operating on pure automation, the perfect mechanical synchronization of living men. The German gunner calmly caught vulnerable spots in the crosshairs of his superb sight. Gromov broke the trajectory at the very last critical second before the enemy volley. Sparks from the constant screaming ricochets brightly illuminated the smoke-filled square. Hot flames from burning fuel licked the wide steel tracks. The temperature inside the fighting compartment reached its limit. The men were slowly suffocating in the acrid propellant fumes. Salty sweat stung their inflamed eyes. The tankers' bodies had become a single, overstretched knot of nerves and burning muscle. The Soviet machine lurched violently into reverse. The tracks ground the debris of a collapsed brick wall with a sickening crunch. The engine roared under the strain. Every shift of the stiff gears cost Gromov unbearable pain in his palms, which were rubbed raw to the meat. The heavy gear selector resisted desperately. The metal was heating up continuously. The wail of the worn transmission bored into their ears. The enemy didn't let go of the target for a single second. The black tank slowly, inevitably traversed its massive turret. The long barrel continuously tracked every chaotic lurch of the Soviet machine. Another yellow flash violently tore through the smoke. The German shell struck the upper glacis with incredible force. The monstrous energy of the impact lifted the front of the multi-ton tank into the air. The road wheels slammed off the cobblestones with a roar. The machine crashed back down heavily. The metal let out a long, piteous groan. Large spall sheared off from the inside of the armor, sprayed directly into the fighting compartment. A red-hot fragment sliced deep into the gunner's unshaven cheek. He didn't even blink. His hands were locked on the hand wheels. His right eye stared unblinkingly, hypnotically into the murky lens of the telescopic sight. "Missed the bastard," Gromov wheezed, stomping the brake pedal until his joints cracked. "We physically cannot take another one to the front," the gunner replied through clenched jaws, frantically spinning the stiff mechanisms. Blood continued to flow steadily from his broken nose onto his chest. "Range, 200 meters." Sokolov's voice remained absolutely dry and hard. The standard firefight was definitively lost. The enemy's armor steel and the high rate of fire of the German gun left no chance in a classic engagement. A direct exchange of blows led only to inevitable destruction. The rules of this duel had to be shattered immediately. The perfect mathematical calculation of the German ace had to be broken. The enemy had to be thrown off balance. A completely non-standard, suicidal approach was required. The logic of a positional shootout had exhausted itself. The commander made the only possible decision. The level of risk was crossing into the realm of absolute madness. The decision crystallized instantly. The logic of survival dictated a single, absolutely suicidal step. Sokolov cast aside the mathematics of a positional engagement. A proper fight would only lead to the certain death of the entire crew. "Gromov, full ahead, straight at him, ram him!" The command, dry and stripped of any human inflection, cut through the ears over the constant crackle of radio static in the throat mics. "Executing," the driver growled. Gromov didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. His heavy boot, soaked in mud and fuel oil, stomped the stiff throttle pedal into the ribbed steel floor until his ankle popped. The multi-ton cast mass of the 46-ton tank lunged forward with a savage, strained roar. The worn transmission wailed as it digested the colossal torque. The distance began to close rapidly, terrifyingly. 200 meters. 150 meters. The Soviet machine was charging in an open frontal assault right into the aimed shot of the lethal, long-barreled German 88mm gun. The black, matte silhouette of the enemy grew rapidly in the murky optics of the vision blocks, which were covered in a dense web of fine cracks. Inside the cramped, white-hot fighting compartment, a ringing, dead silence fell. It was broken only by the steady, strained roar of the overloaded diesel and the deafening screech of broken stone being pulverized by the tracks. Hearts hammered against ribs in heavy, slow, painful thuds. Thick blood pulsed in their temples like a relentless metronome, counting down the final meters of their lives. The ragged, shallow breathing of the exhausted crew escaped in short, raspy puffs in the acrid, cooling propellant haze. The weight of waiting for the inevitable fatal hit pressed physically, tangibly on their shoulders, locking their overworked, cramping muscles. Every tanker felt with his skin, with every exposed nerve, how the enemy gunner was smoothly, without haste, taking up the slack in the stiff trigger mechanism. The hair on the backs of their necks stood up from animal, primal terror. The German machine waited coolly for the perfect 100% closure for a guaranteed, clean punch through the thick frontal armor. 100 meters. "Wait," Sokolov rasped. The commander gripped the metal handles of the periscope with white, trembling fingers. Salty sweat poured into his inflamed eyes, stinging them into burning tears. Gromov had merged with the stiff steering levers into a single biological entity. His mangled hands, rubbed to raw meat, felt the slightest, barely perceptible vibration of the heavy steel hull. The predatory instinct of a veteran driver was working solely on anticipating the approaching certain death. 80 meters. The enemy's black, soot-stained barrel twitched slightly, almost imperceptibly, finally locking on to the captured target. "Now!" In the unthinkable, imperceptible fraction of a second before the yellow flash of the enemy volley, Gromov violently yanked the left steering lever, all the way back, until his shoulder gave a hard, metallic pop. Simultaneously, the right track continued to tear at the cobblestones of the ruined square at maximum RPM with a wild clang. It was a signature, perfectly drilled chaotic maneuver, a pivot turn on one track. 46 tons of Soviet cast steel were thrown into a wild, absolutely uncontrolled skid. The massive armored hull swung around at an unthinkable, acute angle with a deafening, ear-splitting screech. The road wheels shrieked hysterically, kicking up fountains of blindingly white sparks from the slick stone. The German Ace's shot violently tore through the thickened air. The massive armor-piercing shell howled through the thick gray dust, exactly where the geometric center of the Soviet machine's frontal plate had been just a moment before. The enemy's perfect, mathematically calibrated calculation collapsed instantly. The trajectory shifted sharply. The heavy tungsten slug struck the very edge of the massive commander's cupola with a monstrous, deafening screech. The thick welds snapped like glass. A heavy chunk of cast armor steel was torn from the main turret body with a wild, eardrum-shattering roar. Sharp fragments of hot armor sprayed into the fighting compartment in a dense, lethal rain. Sokolov was violently thrown back against the cold metal of the scorched bulkhead. Hot, sticky blood instantly masked the commander's face from a deep, jagged gash on his forehead. His left eardrum ruptured. The entire world around him instantly plunged into a dull, monotonous, pulsing ring. The insane gamble had paid off. The lethal distance had been closed. The enemy's perfect, zeroed-in solution was finally broken. The black German tank had irrevocably lost those precious seconds needed to reload its heavy main gun and re-establish its line of fire. The initiative had shifted entirely into the bloodied, calloused hands of the Soviet crew. "Take out the tracks!" Sokolov roared, hauling himself up and spitting thick, dark blood onto the diamond plate floor, which was slick with spent shell casings. The gunner pressed his battered face against the surviving optics of the telescopic sight. His fingers spun the stiff handwheels of the elevation and traverse mechanisms with frantic, surgical precision. Millimeter by millimeter, the blurred crosshairs jerked and then locked onto the black machine's vulnerable idler wheel and front track link. A cold, precise ballistic calculation emerged from the near-zero visibility and extreme psychological strain. "Target! Fire!" The massive 122mm gun thundered, spitting death. The heavy armor-piercing shell, weighing nearly 55 pounds, screamed from the smoking barrel with a deafening blast. A monstrous kinetic impact rocked the stone square. The German tank's wide track assembly disintegrated into jagged, mangled shreds. Heavy steel links sprayed in every direction with a sickening screech, acting as giant shrapnel that punched through the thick brick walls of the neighboring ruins. The road wheels buckled with a dry, crunching sound under the colossal weight of the sagging, armored hull. The black German tank lurched violently, helplessly, and then froze forever in a cloud of kicked-up dust. The elite, elusive hunter had been transformed into a stationary, paralyzed iron target. The fallen enemy's agony stirred no emotion. Inside the broken men, nothing remained but the cold, methodical calculation of a professional executioner. The wounded loader, wheezing through the searing pain in his shrapnel-pierced left arm, rammed the next heavy shell into the red-hot breach with a final surge of will. The sharp, metallic clang of the massive wedge breech block echoed through the smoke-filled turret like a final death sentence. Gromov pivoted the Soviet machine's mangled hull in a smooth, steady motion, giving his gunner a perfect broadside shot at the frozen black tank's relatively thin side armor. "AP! Right in the side!" The commander's clipped order left no room for hesitation. The crosshairs settled precisely under the base of the massive enemy turret, exactly where the main ammunition rack was stowed, deep within the hull. "On the way!" Another blow, devastating in its penetrating power. The massive AP shell punched through the thin German side steel with ease. The elite enemy's armor split with a nauseating screech as the metal gave way. The deadly duel had reached its brutal finale. The enemy was burning. A massive pillar of thick black smoke rose slowly over the mangled hulk of the German machine. Inside the ruptured hull, the remaining ammunition detonated in a continuous series of heavy, metallic thuds. The enemy's massive turret sagged heavily onto its crushed side. There was no joy. The triumph of victory did not exist as a physical concept. Inside the Soviet vehicle, a heavy, dead silence hung in the air. The paralyzing silence of total inner emptiness. The crew was slowly suffocating in concentrated propellant fumes. The ventilation system had burned out long ago.
Acrid blue smoke filled the cramped fighting compartment, stinging inflamed eyes into bloody tears. Every gasping breath brought sharp, cutting pain to scorched lungs. The air had turned into a toxic cocktail of burnt powder, vaporized oil, scorched wiring, and the copper tang of human blood. The wounded loader collapsed to his knees. His worn boots slipped on the diamond plate floor, which was slick with blood and carpeted in spent brass. The casings burned his skin even through the thick fabric of his trousers. The man's fingers shook with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. His nervous system had suffered an irreversible breakdown under the tension of the engagement. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, wrapped in a dirty bandage through which dark blood seeped in heavy pulses. The loader desperately gripped the heavy metal rammer with his good right hand, trying to clear the smoking barrel. It was a blind, hard-wired muscular reflex, the instinct of a mechanism that must keep functioning at any cost. The metal of the breech radiated an unbearable, suffocating heat. The loader wheezed, smearing grimy sweat across his soot-blackened face. His ragged movements had lost all meaning. Only raw, primal mechanics remained. He shoved the long pole into the glowing maw with all his strength, his chest falling onto the scorching casings. His exhausted brain no longer registered the pain of the burns. The adrenaline rush was fading fast, leaving behind a leaden, bone-breaking fatigue. Cold spasms locked the crew's muscles. Their hearts beat with heavy, frightening stutters. A continuous, high-pitched ringing pierced their ears, the toll of dozens of direct hits against their armor. Every shudder of the multi-ton cast hull echoed in their brains like microscopic explosions. The crew had suffered a severe collective concussion. Thick, dark blood continued to seep from the gunner's nose and ears, falling onto the shattered glass of the optics. He didn't even try to wipe it away. His bloodied hands fell limply from the traverse wheels, his fingers curled in an unnatural cramp. Gromov, the driver, sat below with his battered forehead pressed against the cold metal of the instrument panel. His broad shoulders shook with small tremors in time with the idling engine. He could not unclasp his hands from the steel steering levers. The skin on his palms had split, exposing raw meat. In those endless, agonizing minutes, a terrifying realization of their role in this giant meat grinder dawned on them. They had ceased to be human. They no longer had names, pasts, or futures. Their humanity had been incinerated in the furnace of this close-quarters battle. The crew had become a functional appendage of the heavy tank, biological tools of a ruthless war machine, expendable material meant to ensure the operation of the 122mm gun and the diesel engine. Their lives held no independent value on the scale of the front. All that mattered was the breached line and the destroyed enemy. Any human feelings had atrophied. Only the animal function of survival and destruction remained. This thought brought no fear, only an absolute, icy void. Their souls had been burned to ashes. Outside, the war raged on. Their position in the open square remained lethally dangerous. Thick autumn fog mixed with the acrid black smoke from the burning German armor. Invisible enemy artillery continued to hammer the ruins of Königsberg. Stray 120mm mortar rounds thudded nearby, their fragments hissing through the air with a prolonged screech, raking the cobblestones and clanging against the mangled Soviet armor. The ground beneath the tracks trembled continuously. But inside the crippled steel box, there was a paradoxical, eerie silence. The men just sat in the gloom, listening to their own shallow breathing.
"Shells. 3 left," the gunner whispered, his bloodless lips barely moving. His voice was a raspy, painful croak. "I know," Commander Sokolov replied through clenched teeth. Every word required a colossal physical effort. There was no point in talking. Everyone understood the situation. The line was breached. The enemy was destroyed. The tank was critically damaged. The crew was spent. "Armor's at its limit. The welds are popping." Gromov's hollow whisper drifted up from the driver's seat. "Wait!" The commander cut him off, his inflamed eyes remaining closed. They froze, waiting for the next order, or a stray shell that would put the final period on their personal war. There were no heroes inside the tank, only deathly tired men who had finished their dirty, heavy work. A dull thud echoed from the engine compartment. Thick, acrid smoke immediately billowed from under the armored bulkhead. The fire reached the ruptured fuel tanks, and the diesel ignited. The temperature in the fighting compartment spiked to an unbearable limit, the heat rapidly devouring the meager remains of oxygen. The crippled machine was dying. The flames were closing in on the rack of heavy HE frag shells. Detonation was now a matter of seconds. "Bail out! Move!" Sokolov rasped, ripping the tanker's helmet from his head. The crew scrambled from their scorching seats. Stiff muscles, locked in brutal spasms, refused to obey. The gunner slammed his shoulder against the heavy turret hatch, and the thick metal gave way with a screech. The cold autumn wind, thick with cement dust and soot, roared inside. The wounded loader groaned, his paralyzed left arm hanging limp. Sokolov grabbed him roughly by the collar of his blood-soaked tunic, and with one powerful heave, dragged him out onto the open armor.
Gromov tumbled out through the driver's hatch, scraping his face bloody against the hot metal of the glacis plate.
The tankers rolled heavily down the armor onto the broken bricks. Behind them, the open flames let out a guttural howl. The tank had become a giant, blazing furnace. The air over the ruined square suddenly shattered. German mortar crews had zeroed in on the grid. A series of distant thuds was replaced by a shrill, rising howl as 120mm mortars began to methodically pulverize the cobblestones.
"To cover! In bursts! Move!"
Sokolov barked. Gasping for air, the tankers threw themselves into the thick gray shroud of fog. Their worn boots sank into deep craters. Lungs, scorched by smoke, burned like fire. Steel fragments hissed with a sickening screech, raking the stone walls around them. Another close blast slammed the exhausted crew onto the cold earth. Gromov hit his face hard against a piece of rusty rebar. The ground beneath them trembled. A wave of searing hot air rolled over their backs as the monstrous internal explosion of their own tank finally deafened them. The multi-ton turret was ripped from its ring with a horrific screech, and the shock wave scattered flaming chunks of metal for dozens of yards. There was nowhere to go back to. Their steel shell had ceased to exist. All that remained was the grueling run through the smoking ruins of Königsberg. They crawled over broken glass and hid behind the rusted hulks of burnt-out trucks. The wounded loader left a thick trail of blood on the stones. After 40 minutes of exhausting retreat, the jagged outlines of the Soviet trenches finally emerged from the fog. The infantry met the tankers emerging from hell with a heavy, wary silence. The tank battalion headquarters was located in the damp basement of a building that had miraculously survived. The air smelled of mold and cheap tobacco. Sokolov slumped onto a wooden crate, his right hand clutching an indelible pencil.
He methodically filled out a standard report,
recording the chronology of the battle dryly, without emotion. The breakthrough into the fire sack, the destruction of the ambush, the ramming of the medium tanks, the duel with the elite heavy tank, the signature maneuver, the point-blank shot. Every word was a struggle. The severe concussion pressed against his brain like a lead weight. Suddenly, the door creaked. 3 men descended silently into the dimly lit basement. Perfectly clean, pressed uniforms. No soot, no dirt. The cold, piercing gazes of military counterintelligence officers. The Osobists worked with extreme ruthlessness. The maneuver of a lone heavy tank deep in the enemy's rear had attracted immediate, unwanted attention. "Report on the table, Captain," the group leader said in a flat, monotone voice. Sokolov pushed the handwritten sheet to the edge of the table. The officer's eyes scanned the text. The major's facial muscles didn't even twitch. "This battle never happened," the counterintelligence officer said, neatly folding the paper and tucking it into his leather map case. "The duel in the fog does not exist. The German ambush was suppressed by our heavy artillery. You lost your assigned vehicle to an anti-tank mine." "We burned their ace at point-blank range," the gunner rasped, wiping dried blood from his chin. "Shut up," the officer said, without turning his head. "The details of this operation are strictly classified. Sign the non-disclosure form for state secrets. Otherwise, you'll face a court-martial for the intentional loss of valuable combat equipment." The argument was useless. The trench truth was instantly shattered by the cynical reality of staff reports. The documents were seized. The marks on the maps were erased. The unique experience of destroying an elite enemy was unwanted. The bureaucracy worked flawlessly, erasing living people faster than armor-piercing shells tore through steel. The crew was escorted outside.
In the courtyard stood a brand new medium tank. Not a scratch, not a trace of soot. A staff photographer with a bulky camera was scurrying around the tracks. "Stand closer, comrades! Smile! You're heroes!" the photographer commanded cheerfully. The 4 exhausted men lined up against the backdrop of someone else's armor. Their faces resembled death masks. Empty eyes stared through the photographer toward the void of the burned-out city. Gromov instinctively hid his mangled hands behind his back. The wounded loader could barely stand, leaning against a road wheel. Sokolov stared straight into the lens with a heavy, unblinking gaze. A bright flash blinded them for a fraction of a second. The staff chronicle had captured the correct image for the newspapers. The real story remained locked in a metal safe. The heroism of professionals had turned into thin, grey paper. The crew vanished into the mass of marching companies. May 1945. Ruined Berlin. Heavy guns fire blank rounds into the spring sky. Giant yellow flashes of celebratory fireworks tear through the darkness over the blackened shell of the Reichstag. The capture of the enemy capital brought the slaughter to an end. The streets are packed with screaming, weeping people. The red-hot metal of the war has finally begun to cool. The engines of thousands of heavy machines have been silenced, replaced by the hum of human voices. A grand victory has covered the tormented continent. But inside Captain Sokolov, there was only a dead, hollow silence. The celebration rushed past, failing to touch the men who were burned out from within. The crew of the 46-ton monster had been disbanded by a short order back in the winter. The bureaucratic machine had crushed the synchronized living mechanism into separate, useless parts. The heroes dissolved into the faceless mass of demobilized soldiers. They simply vanished, thrown to the wayside of peacetime
without a single award for that impossible breakthrough.
Gromov, the driver, returned to the tractor factory. His mangled hands, covered in jagged scars, snapped the fragile levers of civilian machines. His muscle memory constantly demanded the stiff resistance of steering clutches. A nervous tick twitched in his left cheek. The loader received a dry discharge paper from the hospital. His left arm had withered forever, hanging like a useless lash after being sliced by a red-hot fragment of his own armor. The gunner was slowly going blind. His retinas couldn't withstand the concussions. Sokolov simply removed his fated shoulder boards. No parades, no gold stars. The system struck them from the lists of living victors. The captain's reports on the tank duel in East Prussia never left the gray safes of counterintelligence. The mathematical calculations of armor penetration angles vanished. The description of the suicidal rotation maneuver was seized. The tactics for destroying an elite German ace were erased. The trench truth posed a threat to the smooth staff reports. The destruction of a prepared ambush by a single damaged vehicle violated every regulation. The bureaucratic apparatus hated such dangerous anomalies. The anomaly had to be liquidated. It was erased from official reality. At night, the mangled nervous system suffered its breakdown. Sokolov would wake suddenly in a bed soaked with cold sweat. The silence of the room was shattered by the piercing screech of tearing metal. His nostrils inhaled the phantom smell of acrid powder smoke. A persistent taste of blood and red-hot copper lingered in his throat. "Target in sight. AP, fire!" The clipped lines of the ghost crew echoed inside his brain. His back muscles reflexively tightened, anticipating the monstrous kinetic impact of an enemy round. His pulse hammered in his temples, bursting capillaries. But around him was only the crushing void of a peaceful night. The killer instincts forged in a steel box were inapplicable here. They continued to fight their silent battle in total, bleak isolation. Adrenaline poisoned their blood, finding no escape. Decades later, nothing had changed. The massive iron doors of the Central Military Archive kept their secrets well. Endless, dimly lit rows of stacks made of cold, gray metal. Millions of cardboard folders, tons of yellowed paper crumbling into dust. The air in these vaults remained dry, freezing, and absolutely still. The paper remembered nothing of the skin-melting heat of a diesel fire. The paper did not scream from the pain of muscles torn by steel. The paper did not bleed onto the diamond plate floor. The paper endured everything. Their beyond-limit skill remained nothing more than a set of dry, typewritten lines. The animal instincts that had shattered the elite armor of the black tank had turned into dull ink. No one ever knew how 4 exhausted men, suffocating in toxic smoke, had turned the tide of a frontal offensive. No one studied their suicidal evasion maneuver in the lecture halls of military academies. No one brought flowers to the site of their tank. The state machine simply stepped over its most effective, most ruthless dogs of war and moved on without slowing down. Oblivion proved more terrifying than any armor-piercing shell. It killed slowly, leaving no visible wounds. The dull metallic clang of an archival lock closing. Heavy iron cabinet number 248. The very bottom shelf. The far left corner. A thin, unremarkable gray folder made of brittle cardboard. Rusted steel staples bit deep into the decaying pages of the heavy tank commander's report. On the front of the cover, under a thick layer of tomb-like dust, a rectangular stamp clearly emerges.
A dry, ruthless bureaucratic seal. Faded purple letters hammered into the gray paper. A strict classification. Permanent storage.